Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes? I think we're just going to start because we have a lot of exciting speakers today that I want to give enough time for. So thank you, everyone, to this seminar on the future of peacekeeping, a relic or a revival. My name is Corine van Emmerik, and I'm a researcher here at DIIS. And together with my colleague, Peter Albrecht, he will take the stage now. We've been working on a study about the future of peacekeeping. And this study has been part of the UN Peace and Security Studies here at DIIS that we're carrying out for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And this is kind of the last one of that collection of studies. And what better way to end with the future, maybe. And it's a very important topic to discuss, not only for Denmark's seat in the Security Council, in the UN Security Council, but also because peacekeeping in itself is inextricably linked to the UN itself. And therefore with multilateral cooperation. So it is a very important hook, in a way, into those wider debates and conversations. But also the timing is interesting because since 2014, no new mandates have been issued. And there was a forced closure of MINUSMA at the end of 23. And when we started our project around that time, the prevailing kind of narrative around peacekeeping was that it was dead. This is what we've been hearing, what we've been reading. Peacekeeping is over. But around the time of the Summit of the Future, this narrative kind of changed, and all of a sudden, the kind of funeral of peacekeeping was cancelled, and there was some kind of sense of maybe there is something to it here. We noticed that there was this realization that UN peacekeeping is unique in its sort, and also that it does have value. But what does that exactly mean, and what does a future-proof peacekeeping might look like? So there's this strong need to rethink and reimagine peacekeeping, especially in these times of interlocking threats, of war, of hybrid warfare, etc. So this is what kind of makes the timing and the topic of this seminar so important and interesting, I would argue. Okay, there we go. But before we move on to the presentations, I thought it might be good to kind of refresh our memory in a way, and to get a sense of how the future of peacekeeping has been imagined by the UN itself throughout the past, because it shows this kind of cyclical nature of some of these debates that we've been having around peacekeeping. Whether it's a relic or whether there is a revival, for example. And this points to the kind of chronic nature of some of peacekeeping's problems, that we haven't quite figured out how to tackle them or how to deal with it. And it's therefore not surprising that kind of the moment that we're in now, let's say from 2023, you see a kind of resurgence also of publications on the future of peacekeeping. And this kind of points to the UN trying to get a grips of what peacekeeping ought to be and what form it should take. So it's very telling that many people are kind of thinking about the future of peacekeeping. So I'll try to briefly kind of take you through some of these key publications and moments and what they can tell us about the future of peacekeeping to kind of prime you for our lovely speakers today. So I'll start in 1988, which is a very interesting time because it's the end of the kind of tail end of the Cold War. And UN peacekeeping won the Nobel Prize for preventing armed clashes and creating conditions for negotiations. And because of the Cold War, the Security Council was a kind of cooperative to a very certain limited degree. So the missions that took place during that time in the Middle East, for example, or in Kashmir, they were limited and they were kept to the core principles of peacekeeping. So that's consent, impartiality, and the non-use of force. And so UN peacekeeping forces winning the Nobel Peace Prize really captures the sentiment of the time, where UN peacekeeping represented a global and communal will and desire for peace. And then in 1992, then Secretary General Boutros Ghali translated these abstract hopes and dreams from the Nobel Peace Prize to a roadmap for global peace in a post-Cold War, Cold War era, which was this kind of long vision of peace and prosperity with peacekeeping as a central role. But after the Cold War, and this we know, conflict changed quite dramatically, and it saw the rise of ethnic conflict, non-state actors, etc. And so we saw a higher demand for peacekeeping missions, but also this mismatch between what was envisioned of what peacekeeping could do and the reality on the ground. So this kind of mismatch was so severe that Boutros Ghali issued a supplement to the Agenda for Peace to kind of fill in the unforeseen gaps, as he called it. And this is where peacekeeping started to reach the limits of its own possibilities, really. And so what I would say is that the supplement to the Agenda for Peace, in a way, symbolizes a recalibration of the future of peacekeeping. So these hopeful dreams were shattered, and the peacekeeping euphoria ended. So new ideas and perspectives were needed to kind of future-proof peacekeeping for the 21st century. Then in the 2000s, there was harsh criticism from inside and outside of the UN. And this produced the Brahimi report, and this was much more realistic about its own limitations and failures and shortcomings. So it also acknowledged that missions had to be more robust in order to protect civilians, especially after the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica. And so also this period saw more missions, especially on the African continent, that had a specific focus on counterterrorism, of course, due to 9/11. And an example is this is MINUSMA, where peacekeepers faced direct attacks from jihadist insurgents. And then 15 years later, the Hippo report contained a comprehensive assessment of peacekeeping operations that maintained and even amplified the pragmatic and realistic tone of the Brahimi report. And it made a case for political solutions and encouraged partnerships with, for example, the African Union. And this was this idea kind of put the UN in a more modest role as an enabler rather than a main kind of operator of these peace operations. And now, which also includes 2023, I would say, with the issuing of the new Agenda for Peace in the lead up to the Summit of the Future in September last year, we see a kind of reckoning with the precarious state of the world and also the uncertainty about the future. And there is an emphasis that the present moment is this inflection point to commit to peace. But peacekeeping had totally lost its central role that it had in the Agenda for Peace in '92. And it was envisioned, I mean, you can kind of read between the lines that there was this kind of phasing out of peacekeeping, and support and coordination became more important. So kind of reinserting this enabler role rather than central position. And good to keep in mind is that, again, no new missions were mandated since 2014, which meant that, which kind of highlights the challenges of implementing and also testing some of these recommendations that were proposed in the Hippo report. And so most recently, in the 2024 Pact for the Future, there's a slight change of sentiment towards peacekeeping, where there is this realization that peacekeeping is a unique strength of the UN and that a review is needed. So it did kind of help to realign member states' visions towards shared goals, and of course, this is unsurprising in kind of the state of the world with wars in Gaza, Ukraine, etc. But it remained much more of a broad consensus and kind of a tentative promise for the future rather than a kind of firm commitment and concrete steps. So this is the kind of fragile state that we're in now. And recently the Department for Peace Operations came out with their kind of study about peacekeeping, their own review, and they proposed 30 models to inspire thinking about the future of peacekeeping. So we go from a templated model of peacekeeping to 30 different mix and match options. And they did this, of course, especially with the upcoming Peacekeeping Ministerial in May. But there are also other perspectives, of course, and other views on the future of peacekeeping that our speakers today will be sharing. And we'll start with Eugene Chen, who published his new vision just ahead of the DPO study, very smart. So I'll start by welcoming Eugene. Eugene Chen is a senior fellow at the NYU Center on International Cooperation, whose research focuses on the interplay of substantive policy, intergovernmental politics, and bureaucratic processes at the UN. Prior to joining CIC, he worked in various positions within the UN Secretariat, including in the Executive Office of the Secretary General and in peacekeeping operations. Earlier in his career, he served as lead negotiator for the United States government at the United Nations on peacekeeping financing and cross-cutting policy issues, the skills of assessments and institutional reform. Eugene holds a BA and MPA from Cornell University. So please join me in welcoming Eugene on stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Excellent. So, thank you so much for that introduction, Corine. And a lot of what Corine just kind of pointed out to us and gave us kind of that background will really kind of helps provide the introduction to my talk here today. So the Pact for the Future, as mentioned by Corine, actually did call for the Secretary General to undertake a review on the future of all forms of UN peace operations. And to many scholars and practitioners of peacekeeping, this feels a little bit of a deja vu. One of the things that I think a lot of us in New York thought when we saw the new agenda for peace that came out a couple years ago was that a lot of the elements are largely the same as what was in the 1995 supplement, and there's still a lot of things that were unimplemented from the 2015 report of the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations. These reviews keep identifying the same types of problems, but there hasn't been enough done to address the underlying causes and to actually overcome some of these. So instead of reiterating the same types of issues that have been reiterated in a lot of these reviews in the past, what I'd like to do today is to offer my assessment of some of those underlying challenges, and then also present what could potentially be a way forward for peace operations for the near future. As was mentioned earlier, a lot of the content that will be in this presentation is actually drawn from a report that I wrote back in October. So if you want to go into some more details, you're welcome to go to the CIC website, which is cic.nyu.edu, and look for the report also titled A New Vision for Peace Operations. So the talk that I'll be giving today, I'll really quickly kind of break it into 5 parts. I'll give a very quick overview of peacekeeping. Then I'll unpack what I see as 4 main challenges for contemporary peacekeeping operations. Then I'll go through some of the elements that I believe really should be considered as part of a new approach for the UN to take when it comes to peace operations. Then I'll highlight a number of key milestones and opportunities that member states and the Secretariat should take advantage of in the next few years, and then do a little bit of a wrap-up at the very end. Now, really quickly for an overview of peacekeeping. For the UN, there's a whole range of activities in peace and security which are collectively known as peace operations. across peace operations, there are four main types of activities that the UN engages in. There's preventative diplomacy to stop crises from breaking out, peacemaking to end the fighting, peacekeeping to support a peace agreement, and peace building to address the risk factors and root causes of violence to also help prevent a future relapse into conflict. Now, this is an oversimplification. There is a lot of overlap in a lot of these, but it's really good to kind of keep these all in mind. Now, peacekeeping amongst all of these is one of the most visible activities of the UN Secretariat. And a lot of that is because it represents the largest share of the personnel of the UN, but also the largest part of the annual budget. Right now, there's approximately 60,000 uniformed personnel deployed and 8,500 civilian staff. There's a total of $5.6 billion in the annual budget, budgets for peacekeeping operations. That's still a very large amount, but it's actually less, it's a third less than the high water mark 10 years ago, when the total amount for peacekeeping operations was more than $8.5 billion. Now, peacekeeping has been a very important tool for conflict resolution and management. Missions have certainly helped oversee the implementation of peace agreements, build state institutions to ensure democratic governance and the rule of law, run elections, and even in certain cases, they've actually directly administered territory. There's many well-known examples of missions that have experienced scandals or failure, but the majority of missions established since the end of the Cold War have achieved at least some success in implementing their mandates. And moreover, in the past decade, there have been several peer-reviewed studies that have shown that peacekeeping operations provide a statistically significant effect in reducing violence and conflict-related deaths in the countries to which they've been deployed. That said, peacekeeping today is facing a major crisis of confidence. There have, as was pointed out earlier, been no new large mission deployed in over a decade. Missions are struggling to implement their mandates, and several missions have been asked by their host governments to leave in the last few years. So the four main challenges I want to highlight in the next few minutes include the range of mandated tasks that missions are asked to implement, the lack of coherence within the UN system to implement some of these activities, kind of the imperative the imperative that drives member states to authorize missions, even when they may not necessarily be the right tools, but then also the broader kind of landscape that we have right now of geopolitical contestation that also deadlocks the Security Council. So, four main challenges. The first one, like I said, mandated tasks. So, the range of tasks undertaken by peacekeeping operations has expanded dramatically since the end of the Cold War, especially since the introduction of the concept of peace building to the UN as part of the 1992 Agenda for Peace. Now, peace building includes a broad range of activities, including the provision of basic safety and security, fostering inclusive political processes, support to core government functions, and also the promotion of human rights and rule of law. Now, the inclusion of individual peace-building activities and mission mandates is largely driven by structural incentives rather than the requirements of individual contexts. What do I mean by this? When you go back and look over the last few decades, you see that in many cases, elected members of the Security Council, in their attempt to try to make sure that they can show some sort of impact or champion individual causes during their 2-year terms, they oftentimes are the ones that push some of their priority agenda items across mission mandates without really necessarily analyzing how applicable or how much of a priority those issues might necessarily need to be in those specific country cases. But there's also a number of incentives within the Secretariat itself. Different thematic units within the Secretariat may also push to promote their particular topics and subjects as well, because the more activities that are in some of these missions, the more influence, staffing, funding, etc. these units have within the Secretariat as well. So that also serves to drive the proliferation of mandates. Altogether, this growth of mandates is what we colloquially know in New York as Christmas tree mandates. Now, there's also a fundamental tension in the principles that underpin peacekeeping operations and peace building. Peacekeeping is premised on consent of the parties, impartiality, non-use of force, except in self-defense and defense of the mandate. Whereas peace building is premised on the idea of national ownership. Now, when you have a mission deployed in a context where there's a comprehensive peace agreement, that might not necessarily be a problem. But in most of the places where we have missions deployed today, we're in situations of civil conflict. And we're talking about the potential of having to support host governments against kind of their opposition groups. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, of course, is that different stakeholders within peacekeeping have different interests and want peacekeeping missions to do fundamentally different things. Western Security Council members, for example, oftentimes really care about protection of civilians and the elements of liberal peace, like democracy, human rights, rule of law. But host governments oftentimes want something very different. In many cases, they want financial and security assistance, they want extension of state authority, and oftentimes they may not necessarily want democracy, human rights, rule of law, because those are actually things that could remove them from power. Opposition groups and local populations that support those groups want justice and addressing of longstanding social, economic, and political grievances and inequality. And so oftentimes missions find themselves pulled in many, many different directions. The need to maintain host country consent, though, oftentimes means that missions have to prioritize the interests of host governments if they want to avoid being kicked out or having a lot of additional restrictions on what they can do in countries. Now, this is particularly the case in situations where missions have mandates that include extension of state authority and a lot of these peace-building type mandates that require alignment with host governments. But this effect is turbocharged when missions are pressed to adopt very robust and militarized approaches to protection of civilians. This is because in practice, in practice, peacekeeping operations will never use force against host country security forces, even if the host country is one of the primary perpetrators of violence against civilians. In practice, when they do use force, they will largely be using it against non-state armed groups and oppositions to the regime. Now, as was mentioned earlier, missions, and not just peacekeeping and special political missions, have recently been expelled from 5 different countries: Mali, Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, DRC, or rather, governments have requested them to leave. They haven't left in all those cases. But these are all examples of places where missions have not necessarily been able to successfully kind of balance all these different competing interests between Security Council members, also host governments, etc. Expulsion is particularly likely when more attractive alternatives to the UN peacekeeping mission emerge. So for example, African Union peace support operations, ad hoc coalitions, or private security companies like the Wagner Group, which offer militarized regime preservation capabilities for a host state without those pesky elements of liberal peace like democracy, human rights, and rule of law that a lot of these host governments, many of which are trending towards authoritarianism, don't really want in the first place. Now, the second main challenge that I want to highlight is the lack of coherence within the UN broadly. Now, of course, there's a lot of challenges within the Secretariat itself. Within the UN Secretariat, it's the Department of Peace Operations that currently supports peacekeeping operations. Now, the predecessor to the Department of Peace Operations, which is the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, was established in 1992 after the end of the Cold War to handle the massive surge in demand for peacekeeping that came after the end of the Cold War. Now, at the time, the UN didn't actually necessarily have the capacity to be able to manage and sustain this massive surge in operations. And so therefore, structures and policies were established within the new Department of Peacekeeping Operations to better allow the UN to plan and manage and deploy a lot of these missions. But the institutionalization of these capacities and kind of more systematic approaches to planning and deployment also led to kind of more templated approaches to how missions were kind of conceived of and also implemented. And so by the early 2000s, the multidimensional protection of civilians mission became, in essence, the preferred model of peacekeeping. And these have oftentimes been saddled with the Christmas tree mandates that we pointed out earlier. Now, The standard approach that the Secretariat has taken when given these types of mandates is to create a mission that has dedicated thematic units responsible for implementing every element of the mission mandate. The thing is, expertise for peace-building tasks in particular also exists elsewhere in the Secretariat, but also in other parts of the United Nations system, particularly within the funds and programs, which are oftentimes represented within the UN country team at the field level. These funds and programs are present in countries before the arrival of missions, but they also persist after the departure of peacekeeping as well. But their expertise is seldom taken into account in the design of missions before they are deployed. Now, where multidimensional peacekeeping missions are deployed in a country, they oftentimes are by far the largest presence on the ground. And there's oftentimes a tendency for missions to disregard the country team until it really comes time to prepare for transition and the eventual withdrawal of those missions. This can cause a lot of resentment at the country level on the part of the funds and programs. So the result is that the Secretariat and the Security Council oftentimes fail to grapple with the fallout and legacy of a mission after its departure. And so that's one of the main challenges on transitions, which I'll actually come back to in a little bit. The third challenge I pointed out earlier is about the imperative to act, and oftentimes the desire to deploy peace operations in response to crises, even when peacekeeping might not necessarily be the right tool. For many countries in the Security Council, whenever a crisis breaks out, the desire to do something, to be visibly doing something, really oftentimes is driving the decision-making process. And protection of civilians is a really good example of this. As I mentioned earlier, since the early 2000s, POC has become the main focus of peacekeeping missions. But POC has also become a vector for the transformation of peacekeeping into militarized stabilization or counterterrorism operations, especially where Western Security Council members are increasingly pushing for militarized, robust approaches to protection of civilians. But as I mentioned earlier, the state is one of the main perpetrators of violence against civilians. And if the missions are using force, they're usually very unbalanced in how they apply that force. The fact that a lot of times these missions kind of are supporting host country security forces in some of these operations also contributes to what some scholars have called the stabilization dilemma, which is that when host governments can rely on external sources of support to help them manage their own kind of security interests vis-a-vis opposition groups, it actually reduces the incentives of the host government to engage in the dialogue with opposition groups necessary to actually resolve the underlying kind of political conflict in those countries. And therefore, the short-term desire to reduce violence in particular country contexts can actually end up prolonging conflict and potentially exacerbating violence in the longer term. And then, of course, the last of the four main challenges that I highlighted earlier is about geopolitical contestation and competition. We already see this a lot in the deadlock that we see in the Security Council. This deadlock prevents some real rethinking of approaches, establishment of new missions, but also changing course in a lot of existing missions as well. So where does that leave us? What should we do moving forward? So the HIPPO, which was mentioned earlier, HIPPO stands for the High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations. It came out 10 years ago, but it had two main recommendations that have not really been taken forward. And one relates to the primacy of politics. This is the recognition that the main objective of missions should be the political resolution of conflict, and that all the other activities of a mission should really be in support of this particular objective. Now, the second main recommendation of the HIPPO that hasn't really been taken forward is the need to allow the UN to be able to draw upon the full spectrum of peace operations. This is a recognition that the rigid and oftentimes artificial distinction between different types of missions, for example, peacekeeping operations and special political missions, oftentimes prevents the UN from either having the full range of tools and configurations to be able to address the specific needs of individual country contexts in a targeted and tailored manner. But it also prevents missions from having the flexibility to be able to adapt to changing political and security circumstances. Now, one of the main obstacles to moving towards a more flexible, tailored approach is the fact that peacekeeping missions and special political missions today are led by two different departments which have competing interests, and the fact that since the 1990s, different approaches have emerged for how these different types of missions are planned, budgeted, and staffed. So where does that leave us? One of the things that that certainly that I believe from having worked within peacekeeping and working on these issues over the last 15 years is a way that we can work within existing frameworks to overcome some of these templated approaches is for missions to not try to do every aspect of the mandate themselves, but to take advantage of expertise that's already resident within a lot of these countries, and to delegate responsibility for those activities along with the associated resources from the mission budgets. Members of the UN country team, again, the funds and programs of the UN system that are present on the ground, are already particularly well suited to take on a lot of peace-building tasks that require alignment with host state institutions, because a lot of their activities are already undertaken on the basis of a cooperation framework that's been signed with the host government. And in 2023, actually, when the UN reviewed and revised its integrated assessment and planning policy, it actually took a step in this direction when it said that the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework is actually supposed to be the overarching planning framework for peace building and sustaining peace activities. So there's already a very clear entry point for country team activities to be taking the lead and to be thinking about using their existing frameworks to support peace building activities. And we do have a lot of precedent for this type of activity in the past. So for example, UNDP and UNICEF did actually do a lot of the implementation of the rule of law and gender mandated tasks for the last UN mission in East Timor in the final stages of its mandate. But also I want to point out that regional organizations can also be delegated tasks by the UN. For example, the original mandate of the UN mission in Kosovo had an entire pillar that was actually handled on behalf of the UN by the OSCE. This way, different actors in country can focus on those types of tasks that are within their respective comparative advantage, while the peacekeeping mission itself can really focus on its core objectives of supporting the political process in a much more impartial manner. So what does this actually look like in practice? So I think maybe the way to kind of illustrate this is to start with, what do peacekeeping missions look like today? This is basically what every one of our multidimensional missions looks like today. The key elements to take into account are that there are two deputy special representatives of the Secretary General. And underneath each one of them are a number of substantive units that are responsible for each of the thematic mandate areas undertaken by civilians within that mission. Now, another element to keep in mind is that here under the Chief of Staff, you have all the kind of the planning, analysis, and situational awareness functions of the mission. And then you also have a mission support pillar that handles logistics, service delivery, and administrative functions. And these are all distinct from the capacities that are within the country team. The country team has its own planning capabilities, it has its own support capabilities, and in some cases a common back office. So where should we potentially be moving towards? So this is an idea for what how the UN could potentially be thinking about the configuration of their presences in countries in the future. Here you have a situation where when the mission mandate includes a lot of peace building activities that can be done by the country team, rather than creating individual substantive units for those activities within the mission itself, they can actually just be delegated to the various funds and programs that are already in the country. It's only for those types of activities that cannot be done by the country team, or for which no existing capacity exists, which then might need to be kind of done within the mission with its own particular units. But moreover, it's also important to potentially see if all the different kind of planning, analysis, and situational awareness capabilities between the mission and the country team can be kind of consolidated and co-located so that you have a common understanding of the situation on the ground and better coordination across all the different parts of the UN in a particular country. And you can also leverage economies of scale by putting together all the different mission support and business operations activities in the country, potentially kind of through joint financing, rather than replicating it across the mission and the country team in that particular country. Now, it's important to note, of course, that the Security Council can't directly task the funds and programs, but it is still within the purview of the Secretary General to decide to delegate tasks to the UN country team. Now, already there are limited examples of this type of idea of delegating tasks to the country team that are already being done in a lot of missions. For example, missions oftentimes engage members of the UN country team to implement projects funded under the programmatic activities elements of mission budgets. And so one way to kind of think about this approach moving forward is to consider the resolutions adopted by the Security Council not as conferring mandates to the mission per se, but rather giving mandates to the UN writ large, and then for the Secretary General to assign responsibility to the parts of the UN system that are best suited to implement the different parts of the mandate. Now, the other real benefit of this particular approach comes in transition contexts. One of the persistent challenges that we've seen time and time again during transitions is that when missions withdraw from the country, they also take with them a lot of capacity, programmatic continuity, and also institutional memory that all kind of become lost. So if the peace-building tasks that require much more a longer time horizon than kind of the life cycle of the mission, if those activities are being done by the country team from the get-go, you don't have this kind of loss of capacity, programmatic continuity, and institutional memory upon the departure of mission. And so you're able to kind of have a lot more of that seamless continuity even after the end of the mission. One other thing I think it's important to think about looking ahead is also whether the General Assembly can play a larger role, especially if the Security Council is going to be deadlocked. The General Assembly has actually in the past been a large source of innovation when it comes to peace operations. We oftentimes forget, but the very first armed peacekeeping operation was actually mandated by the General Assembly. That was the UN Emergency Force in the Sinai. Also, the very first transitional administration mission was also authorized by the General Assembly. That was the UN Transitional Executive Authority in West Irian in Papua New Guinea back in the 1960s. And also the very first hybrid mission was authorized by the General Assembly, and that was the UN Organization of American States mission in Haiti in the 90s. The General Assembly also has the benefit of not having a lot of the stigma that comes with a country being on the agenda of the Security Council. And also, currently, anybody who followed the negotiations over the Pact for the Future knows that sovereignty is a huge concern of a lot of member states these days. And the General Assembly, by definition, cannot undertake Chapter 7 missions. Every type of mission that they do authorize has to have host country consent. And so it may also make it more likely for host countries to accept General Assembly mandated missions versus Security Council missions. It's also notable to think of the prevention angle. The Pact for the Future and the New Agenda for Peace also talked about national prevention strategies. And GA-mandated missions may therefore also be potential vehicles through which the UN can actually better support the national prevention strategies called for in the Pact for the Future. Now, how might we actually go about doing this? Now, historically, most of the missions that have been authorized by the General Assembly were done through the third committee of the General Assembly on the basis of a Secretariat fact-finding report. But one of the things that we might want to do moving forward is looking at whether there's a role for the Peacebuilding Commission to be able to actually advise the General Assembly on the potential authorization of missions moving forward. The Peacebuilding Commission today primarily advises the Security Council, but because it is a body that reports to both the Security Council and the General Assembly, it can actually provide that advice to the General Assembly. I think there's two types of contexts in which this could be useful. Number one is, of course, transition contexts. Right now, when a country that is hosting a peacekeeping mission has that kind of mission complete and depart, it falls off the Security Council agenda. And so it doesn't actually have a lot of that attention from member states when, in fact, the immediate years after the closure of a mission is a time when there's actually a heightened risk of relapse into conflict. And so by having a way for the Peacebuilding Commission and the General Assembly to be able to kind of look at the potential for kind of looking at these country situations and potentially authorizing configurations in those countries, it may be a way of helping to prevent kind of that backsliding. But of course, the Peacebuilding Commission can also recommend the deployment of capabilities or missions to support kind of peacebuilding or prevention tasks. And this can either be in the form of, small, light footprint standalone missions, or capacities to augment the existing resident coordinator's office and the country team without the need for a standalone mission. So, looking ahead, what are some of the types of processes and milestones in the next few years that can be utilized to kind of help move some of these elements of a potential new vision for peace operations forward? In 2025, later this year, as was mentioned, there is a Peacekeeping Ministerial being hosted in Berlin in May, and that will be an opportunity to have some high-level attention on some of these aspects of the future of peacekeeping. But there's also an ongoing peacebuilding architecture review. This is something that happens every 5 years, and this is an opportunity for member states to also think about whether the overall kind of composition of the UN's peacekeeping architecture is fit for purpose and whether there's any adjustments that need to be made. One of the things that is being discussed is the potential strengthening of the Peacebuilding Commission, so that provides a really good kind of entry point for some of these discussions. And of course, there's also the review of the future of all forms of peace operations called for in the Pact for the Future. Beyond that, there's also a number of kind of more administrative processes looking at some of the nuts and bolts that really drive the incentives behind peacekeeping operations. So the Working Group of Contingent Owned Equipment and Rates of Reimbursement to Troop and Police Contributing Countries in 2026. This is the very first time that both sets of reimbursement will be considered at the same time. And so that's also an opportunity to get some of that internal machinery, but also the incentives for performance and accountability right. And of course, we have another Secretary General coming in 2027, and every Secretary General since the end of the Cold War has started their term with a structural reform agenda. So that's also an opportunity to be able to look at whether things are set up in the right place. But of course, it's also important to note that there is the reality that we live in right now. Difficult times are ahead in the UN. And when I think a lot of us are expecting large cuts to assessed contributions to the UN, including for peacekeeping operations. But of course, there may be a silver lining here in that the demands that are likely to come for reform and the impulse by the new administration to move fast and break things may actually provide the bit of a shock necessary to be able to make some of these necessary and long overdue changes. So, to wrap up, the overarching question raised in this seminar is whether revival or relic which of those terms is really kind of how we see peacekeeping operations in the future. I think the way that we have been doing peacekeeping should be a relic, but there is still an important role for peacekeeping and peace operations writ large to play in the maintenance of international peace and security. If the UN is able to kind of seize the moment and pivot and make all those necessary shifts to address the shortcomings that have become very evident over the last few decades, they can potentially help rebuild the confidence necessary to reverse the marginalization of the UN in the resolution and management of conflict. This is especially the case if some of these militarized alternatives, such as ad hoc coalitions and African-led peace support operations with peace enforcement mandates, if those fall short. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for that incredibly thought-provoking presentation, and so refreshing to hear some concrete ideas about how to move forward. Okay, so next up, and also just to say, if you have any questions or comments, please hold on to them, because we'll do all the presentations and then we have enough time for discussion and Q&A. So please hold your questions. Okay, so next up is Jenny Lorentzen. Jenny is a senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, and she conducts research on the Women, Peace, Security, Women, Peace and Security agenda, and gender in relation to peace processes, peacekeeping, peace building, and security sector reform. And before joining NUPI, she worked as a postdoctoral fellow in the Gendered Militaries Project at the Department of Political Science at Lund University, where she conducted research on how international and Malian actors promote and or contest different ideas of gender in reform of the military security sector and on women's participation in the peace process in Mali. Welcome, Jenny.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation. And also thank you to Corine and Eugene for the sort of introductions and presentations so far. I guess my presentation, we kind of take it a little bit down into the details and zoom in on women, peace and security and peacekeeping. And I'm going to talk about how peacekeeping can contribute to advancing women, peace and security, using some examples from other people's research and my own research. And then I'll reflect a bit on the challenges going forward. So to just start with women, peace and security, for those who are not working on that every day, as I am. Well, women, peace and security sort of has its sort of starting point in the UN with UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was adopted in the year 2000. Since then, 9 more resolutions on women, peace and security have been adopted by the Security Council, and this sort of forms the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The Women, Peace and Security agenda can be understood as a sort of normative framework that the UN and its member states have sort of, through these resolutions, committed itself to. And it involves, I would say, promoting gender equality along these kind of 4 pillars in peace and security efforts, and at all levels, right? And actually, peacekeeping was mentioned specifically in the first resolution in 2000. So peacekeeping has really been very central part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the work on women, peace and security in the UN system. And there has been a lot of, I mean, since 2000, we've seen a lot of developments in missions with gender advisors, gender units, women protection advisors, and also we've seen all-female battalions and police units. And there has been a lot of work done to sort of mainstream gender across missions and across activities. So, and one of the sort of first, or one of the aspects, I guess, that has gotten a lot of attention and that got a lot of attention early on was sort of to increase the number of female peacekeepers. So this was like one of the first priorities for the UN system. And currently, the UN has its gender parity strategy from 2018, with this ambition to have 25% women among military experts and staff officers and 15% among troops in UN peace operations. And so for 2024, they're actually not doing bad at all on the goal among military experts and staff officers, but they're not so close to the goal on female peacekeepers among military troops. But I mean, a lot of the research on sort of female peacekeepers, because this is easily measurable, right? So it has gotten a lot of attention. So a lot of feminist scholars have also sort of been quite critical about this attention, because a lot of the time you see arguments about operational effectiveness when we talk about why should we have female peacekeepers. So to say sort of that that adding women will sort of create more gender equality within the missions, right? And sort of that having women there will sort of deter male officers or peacekeepers from behaving violently. But how, you know, and it's a big burden to put on the shoulders of these female peacekeepers. So So for many female peacekeepers, it becomes actually a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, where they have to live up to very high expectations to fit into sort of very gender or to fit into gender stereotypes, and they have to work harder than their male colleagues. And this is especially burdensome for female peacekeepers from the global south, because actually a lot of the female peacekeepers from the global north are higher ranking than the ones from the global south. So they come in also as lower ranking officers, adding a sort of double burden there, you could say. Yes. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about mandates. I guess that's fitting after Eugene's talk. Because here we have seen a huge expansion, right? So today, the references and the provisions on women, peace and security are quite standard, at least in the sort of multidimensional peacekeeping operations mandates. And it's a lot of emphasis on improving women's security, so what we refer to as sort of protection and prevention pillars of the women, peace and security agenda. But then over time, the attention to the participation pillar has also increased. And there has been, in recent years, there's been a push to increase that, because that was sort of lagging behind. And it has, as Eugene explained very well, this has been a big push by members of the Security Council, who have sought to provide greater accountability on advancing women, peace and security. But the problem is, of course, that this has not always been accompanied by the allocation of adequate resources. So missions have quite expansive mandates, but they don't always have the resources to implement them. And then since 2015, the UN Security Council signaled that they would sort of elevate the priority of women, peace and security references in the mandates. But actually, this study shows that between 2015 and 2021, there was a small decrease in references to women, peace and security, and especially in country-specific situations. And then what we see in the mandates is that the mandates tend to focus on the one hand, to give tasks to the peacekeeping operations so that they will support that will support the advancement of gender equality in the host country. So, for example, protection of women from violence, preventing and responding to sexual and gender-based violence, etc. And then on the other hand, there are a number of provisions that focus on enabling the mission to be more effective. So, for example, through increasing the number of women in missions, or prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. And this reflects sort of how should I say, two perspectives or two rationales on sort of women, peace and security in peacekeeping. But this is actually recognizable across many other fields, not only in peacekeeping. But this idea that peacekeeping can be a vehicle to promote women, peace and security and gender equality. So it's good for gender equality, it's good for the women, peace and security agenda, which can be promoted through peacekeeping. But then the other rationale is also that promoting gender equality, promoting women, peace and security will make peacekeeping more effective. So these are sort of two perspectives that we can also recognize in the formulation of the mandates. Yes, and then just to kind of bring it down to one example, we published this report last year. It's one of the reports from the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network that my colleague Cedric de Koning coordinates. And this report is on women, peace and security in MONUSCO. And so for this report, we looked at MONUSCO is the peacekeeping operation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Yes. And this is, of course, a mission that has a lot of challenges at the moment, as it is in a process of transition and facing a sort of reignition of the conflict in the country. But this report looks backwards more than forwards, I would say. So we actually studied the mandates between 2010 and 2021, looking at the sort of women, peace and security language. And we also looked at how and to what extent the mission was able to implement those elements of the mandate, and also what factors sort of impacted their ability to do so. And here comes the Christmas tree, I guess. But what we did find in this sort of analysis of the texts, the mandate texts, was that the expansion, I mean, it's very a clear quantitative increase, right, in references and provisions on women, peace and security. And this reflects the global trend that I talked about before. And then they also sort of expand in the range of topics or themes that are covered. And we see, of course, that there's been a lot of focus on prevention and protection, also sort of in response to developments on the ground. But then there's also been an expansion in the theme on participation. So, which also follows the global trend pretty much. And then, so when we looked at how they have been able to implement the mandate, what we found was that they were, they had been sort of developing a range of innovative practices that were targeted at improving women's security or increasing women's participation in sort of national institutions or in peace processes and strengthening gender equality. So, for example, they set up a women mediators network, did work to map security threats to women, or supported initiatives to address discriminatory media coverage, and also supported the development of gender-sensitive DDR programs. And the mission also worked a lot internally, and this is, how should I say? So they used the gender scorecard to keep the different parts of the mission more accountable. So the missions would the sections would self-report according to the scorecard, and then you could also see improvements from year to year, right? So because the gender unit actually works mostly internally in the mission, so their job is to sort of help the other or support the other units to integrate gender perspectives in their work, and then it's mostly the other units that will do the sort of more externally oriented activities. And then also, of course, the commitment of mission leadership plays a role. and this is the current SRSG. And we also, in terms of the factors that impacted their ability to implement the mandate, well, what we found was that they were doing quite a lot with quite limited funds, or at least or limited resources. Overall, mission staff often express that there is not enough resources to actually implement all of the provisions in the mandate. And there were also limited funding to support gender-sensitive programs, and they were also struggling with the lack of trust that the local population has in the national security institutions, and slow implementation of national reforms. And this is perhaps also an important realization to bring, because when we looked at the mandate texts, not all the provisions are expected to be carried out by the mission. A lot of it also is directed to the host country or other actors, right, in the UN system, like troop contributing countries or even the Secretariat. So peacekeeping can help promote women, peace and security, but it is a shared responsibility. Yeah, I think I already kind of said all these things. And then, of course, with the transition process, I mean, there we have all the big questions on how to maintain a focus on women, peace and security, how to keep, make sure that WPS remains a priority when the transition process is happening. And then I also wanted to highlight another a piece of research that I was doing, which was not focusing specifically on the peacekeeping operation, but because I was doing research on women's participation in the peace process in Mali, and I was mapping the different actors involved in the process that led up to the adoption of a gender quota. A 30% gender quota was adopted in the what's called the agreement, or what was called the Agreement Monitoring Committee, in the peace process. And this peace process is or was active from 2015 to 2023. This process is no longer in existence, which is also a whole other discussion, of course. But as part, but it was quite unexpected and a big achievement when they did actually manage to get a gender quota adopted in this committee, which was sort of the highest decision-making forum in the peace process. So as I was looking at the different actors involved, and MINUSMA was of course one of them, I was also looking at the mandates. And and so I looked at the references to gender or women in the MINUSMA mandates in this period from 2013 to 2020. Actually, I looked at the 23 mandates, but there was no references, so that's why it's not included. And what you see here is actually that what I coded here was the language on women's participation. So the like white gray things you can ignore, because that's all the references to gender or women that deals with something that has nothing to do with the peace process. But the purple and the green is about women's participation in the peace process. And what this tells us is that they changed the sort of nature of the references from being very general. So for example, to say, oh, we should include more women in the peace process, to a more specific reference, which would be, we should have 30% women in the Agreement Monitoring Committee. And this started changing from like 2018. You see it becomes more specific. And then in 2020, 2020, you had the actual introduction of the gender quota. So then you can also see it goes down a bit after that. Yeah, no, it's actually the numbers. It's not that many. Yeah. So this is just to show that there is, I mean, that there are different ways of having provisions on women, peace and security in the mandate. And actually, I mean, what was also, oh no, I'm not sure. What? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, and to show also how can these peace operations contribute, because I mean, MINUSMA was only one actor among many who contributed to the adoption of the gender quota in the peace process. But the sort of sustained or the increased pressure that putting these demands in the mandate, or the requests in the mandate. They also requested the high-level workshop to be held by the Malian parties. So they became, so the requests from the Security Council increased, became more specific. The work of the MINUSMA gender unit and mediation unit also intensified, but then that happened sort of in parallel with mobilization by the women's movement in Mali, and also a lot of other actors who supported and sort of worked in and around the peace process to achieve this. And then another example of how peacekeeping can contribute to promoting women, peace and security is from this study on the MINUSMA specialized police team. And this was a specialized police team that provided capacity building in crime scene management to the Malian security forces as part of the UN peacekeeping operations in Mali. And this was a Norwegian led team, a small team. And they sort of were organizing courses and being mentors for those Malian officers. And here they had a project that was about crime scene management, right? It was not a project about gender or women, peace and security or anything like that. It was also the case that there were absolutely no references. I've read the project document. There were no references to gender, women, peace and security, Resolution 1325, CEDAW, nothing. So it was gender equality or women, peace and security was not a topic in the project aims. But when I interviewed these Norwegian officers, they sort of talked about and showed an awareness about the role of Norway as a global promoter of gender equality, and they also considered it their job to promote gender equality and women's participation, and they could give many examples of how they had worked to achieve this, and how they had always tried to have a certain proportion of women in the trainings, etc., etc. And when I asked them where this came from, they couldn't really sort of pinpoint. Because they were like, yeah, it's not in the project document, but you know, they referred to the mandate, the MINUSMA mandate, and also sort of saying like, because this is the way we do it as Norwegian, you know. So I think these findings sort of show a little bit the potential for this kind of support to also promote norms such as gender equality while they are doing other things, in a sense. So so when police, for example, are deployed to peacekeeping missions to provide expertise on a certain topic, they can also simultaneously promote liberal international norms and ideas, including gender equality. And this also shows the importance of gender mainstreaming in the security sectors of the troop and police contributing countries. So like if you just kind of start to think about that as soon as they arrive in the mission, maybe it's a bit late. But I mean, there's lots of research on pre-deployment training as well. Yeah, but so just a few examples there. I wanted to also just mention a few of the sort of critiques from feminist scholars in particular. I mean, there has been a lot of research on the sort of peacekeeping economies and transactional relationships that take place in peacekeeping settings. This is very controversial. And the research is also, how should I say, it takes different positions on this. But of course, also the challenges with sexual exploitation and abuse that are very real and are a very big problem. Also because the UN struggles a lot to sanction these violations. And then there are also sort of scholarship that highlights the sort of the colonial, imperial, racial, and gendered power relations that are reproduced through peacekeeping. And as I mentioned, this kind of added burden on female peacekeepers. But if we try to stick to the agenda of the seminar, if we, thinking a little bit about women, peace and security and the future of peacekeeping, I think that there are quite a few challenges ahead. As has been mentioned, the challenges in the Security Council, but they are not only geopolitical, or these geopolitical challenges also involve a sort of general pushback against language on gender in particular. It's my impression that some language on women, peace and security is more acceptable, also because it is quite well institutionalized. But there is a general pushback, and sometimes this is also used, I guess, in other to sort of mark a stance or a difference. But this really affects, of course, discussions in the Security Council, but also in other forums. And I think it's important to recognize that the level of ambition in these mandates, and it's also what we found in our study on MONUSCO, right? That it is very ambitious mandates, and the missions do not necessarily have the resources needed to implement them. So there needs to be a better matching of mandates and resources. I think someone should do a study on the future of peacekeeping, or of how different types of missions work with women, peace and security, because I think it's what we know is mostly from multi-dimensional missions. And then, of course, there are some scholars, such as Marcia Henry, who suggest we should abolish peacekeeping because of its sort of colonial and racial and gendered aspects. But I mean, we can also so the question is whether to abolish or reform, right? But I think, I think part of what I wanted to convey with my presentation is that there has been a lot of trial and error over the past 25 years of women, peace and security in UN peacekeeping, and I think we should learn from that, at least. And then all of these new approaches that are now being discussed, what are the consequences for women, peace and security? And here I wanted to highlight also the sort of new prospects that comes with Resolution 2719 on support to AU-led peace support operations, because these are, as Eugene said, more often peace enforcement, more militarized operations. They will not have those same types of mandates, and they will also have a different composition. And also, it's interesting to note that the highest number of female peacekeepers are from these Asian countries, and African countries do deploy female peacekeepers, but in smaller numbers. And also, I think that it's very unclear how mandates will be formulated in the case of these operations. And I mean, yes, it is has been a lot of lobbying by the UN system, by the elected members, and to achieve the sort of level of language that we have seen in some of these in some of these peacekeeping mandates over the past few years. But yeah, and I don't think we can necessarily expect to see that in the future. So that was a bit of a bleak end to my talk, unfortunately, but I look forward to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for a bleak but important and gendered perspective, right? So next up, I hope everyone is still doing okay and holding up so far before the break. Next up is Thomas Mandrup. Thomas is an extraordinary associate professor at Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and associate professor at the Royal Danish Defence College here in Denmark. He's also a member of the SATSAM Steering Committee, a network of security and defense-related research entities in Southern Africa. And he's also published articles, book chapters, co-edited several books on issues related to the African security governance, climate security in Africa, peace missions, and South African foreign policy. And he's currently working on a project that I think you'll talk about on SADC military operations against IS, another stabilization operations in the Sahel. And he's currently finalizing a monograph on South Africa National Defense Force. So I'll say go ahead, Thomas. It's a long introduction, but yeah.
Is that better? Yes? Okay, just turn it on. No, but what I'm saying is that I'm going to do a more bottom-up, looking from the African point of view. I've done fieldwork in most of in the Congo 10 times. I was in Mozambique last year to look at the Southern African Development Community's mission there. Been to Mali, Somalia, to Amisom, these places and all that. So I've done a lot of fieldwork on the ground, being on patrol with the troops on the ground, and also with the African Union forces. And of course, being located at a military college, both in South Africa but also in Denmark, it means that when I have to lecture to officers, it's quite important that I'm, as a civilian, can say I've actually been out in operations. I can see how you operate, so I can actually know what you're talking about. So I'm not talking from a desk point of view. But triggered by the two excellent colleagues in their presentations, I think, again, working on South Africa is always, when talking women, peace and security, there's this conundrum. South Africa has got more than 20% of its peacekeepers being women, and it's got one of the worst sea records in the world. And that's been constant for years. So there's a conundrum here, which of course is always interesting. Why is that? Why is it that you have more than 20% of your peacekeepers being deployed and it doesn't help, and it still have the cases and all that, which I think is another discussion for another day, but and all that. But what I'm going to talk about is what I've called the peace operations between a rock and a hard place, AU African-led and owned peace missions, a view from the ground up. The reason why I say African and AU/African-led is that one thing is that we talk about the strategic partnership between the AUN and the African Union. We are no longer deploying UN missions. We look to others to do it. We look to the African Union. It's in the Danish Africa strategy, increased cooperation with African Union and its regional organizations, African solutions to African problems. There's a strategic partnership signed between the UN and AU since 2017, which designates that African Union is a special partner to the UN in the implementation of all that. The Hippo report, which was mentioned, talks about distribution of labor, that some can do the more robust kind of operations because the UN is not very good at that, then some others should do that and all these kind of things. And then at the same time, we are in a situation where the African Union member states do not want the African Union to deploy, because they do not trust the African Union. So they deploy in ad hoc coalitions, bilaterally, and in different frameworks. And that creates a lot of problems for us, because our Africa strategy is based on cooperating with regional organization, African Union. It creates a lot of problems for the UN, because Resolution 2719, which has been mentioned several times, which actually designate that UN can use assessed contribution up to pay up to 75% of AU-led operations. But if the AU is not deploying, if others doing it, the UN doesn't want to pay. And we see that right now with the SADC force in Congo. The SADC force expected to be financed with assessed contributions from the UN Security Council. The money didn't arrive because this was a SADC operation. The AU was not involved, and the UN Security Council didn't want to pay. We see it with African AU mission in Somalia, the new mission that was changed mandate here 1st of January. Right now, if they're lucky, they have money for the first 6 months, and they can't agree on the financing model for that mission. And they're actually looking into a crisis right now. And then there came an excellent paper out about Institute for Security Studies published yesterday, which talks about these kind of issues. But this actually, so we have these structural problems. So what is it that we talk about, and why is that, and all that? So that's some of the things I'm going to talk about. But this thing is not new. I think it's the thing where it's actually one can say is, when did we discover this? When did we see this? I became aware because I was asked by the AU to do a study on the MAJTF, Multinational Joint Task Force in Lake Chad, 3-4 years ago, where we did an assessment of the AU contribution to that mission. And then suddenly you say something is happening here. There's a change. There's a change of sentiment going on. But if you go back and trace it, it already started back in 2013, where the South Africa, Senegal, Uganda put together what they called a CIRC. A CIRC was the Africa Crisis Response Capacity, which was a force that was put alongside the AU because these 13 states that went together they was dissatisfied with the AU and its AU's ability to respond. So they put together a force alongside the AU and challenged the AU. And then since then, we saw the anti-LRA force in Uganda. We saw the G5 Sahel force. We saw the MNJTF in Lake Chad. We saw now with the Accra initiative, states going together in Ghana, doing outside the traditional structures, because the AU is not delivering. And that is that is a challenge. Why is the AU not delivering? We are actually in a situation where we have 55 member states, but we have a peace support division with 81 employees, 81, to do everything. It's planning, military planning, it's policy, it's everything, and of course they cannot carry that weight to do these kind of operations. So right now, the AU is running the operation in Somalia, and the rest of the operations are done by bilateral, ad hoc institutions in Africa, and that's a challenge. We talked about this. We have seen a decrease in UN operations, and that meant it doesn't mean that we see a decrease in peace operations. It just means that the UN is not doing it, someone else is doing it. And we see here, actually this number is down to 54,000 at the moment, but we're going down from the height of 110,000. We see increased number of AU and African sub-regional organizations being deployed. So actually we see a move away from traditional UN missions into AU missions here. And I'm going to talk about Africa and UN role here. So there's this move away from that. And there's something interesting around that fact. Why is that? One of the things is that it's because of all this. There's this I heard it like 15 years ago in the AU headquarters. Why do we send in peacekeeping when there's no peace to keep? So why do we send in Chapter 6 or Chapter 7 operations with limited offensive capabilities to actually handle this kind of situation we've seen in Darfur, in Somalia, and other places? So there was this wish, there was also part of the CIRC kind of sentiment, that we need more military robust operations to be able to go in and do this, and then we can have the UN coming in afterwards. So we have a military force going in, creating the space for 6 months, then the UN can go in and do what UN is good at, doing the peacekeeping, and then build up on peace building and all that. But someone else should do it, because the UN is not very good at and all that. And then again, I've done field work in Congo like 10 times. I've been there many times since 2004. And it's a sad thing to stand and look at what's going on at the moment. But there's nothing new there. There's nothing new. It's the same solutions, it's the same things I've heard since 2004, I see again being presented. And it's a UN force with the same kind of problems they are faced with. What do we expect? The UN, a good example here. Right now we have a situation where half the population of North Kivu is on the run. They're internally displaced. We have a UN force of 11,000 in that area. They have a new mandate from December with a very starch focus on POC, protection of civilians, but they haven't got the capabilities to implement that mandate. They have limited numbers of helicopters. They are not a robust force, and they're facing an opposition that is militarily much stronger. So they're designed to fail. And on top of that, they then also have to provide logistics and support for offensive operation deployed by the Southern African Development Community, which is also struggling for other reasons. I'll come back to that. But bottom line is that the UN is often criticized, the UN peace missions are criticized for not being effective, because they're not giving, there's a discrepancy between mandates and the capabilities of what the UN is good at. And I think that is one of the things where we need to look at, and that's one of the things that you meet in the African Union quite often, that they're quite tired of that, and all these kind of things. So, but this talk, of course, is about the future of peace operations. And quite interesting, in June last year, Lacroix, what is called Deputy Secretary General for Peace Operations, had a seminar in New York on the future of peace operations. And we're sitting there in the headquarters. And then when the meeting was finished, General Kamer, the Dutch general who was the deputy in MONUC at the time, he was the head of Sherbrooke, and he'd been a special advisor to the Secretary General on peace operations and all that. He stood up and said, I thought this seminar was about the future of peace operations. You've been talking about how peace operations were. And that was spot on. And I think the problem here being that we need to think out of the box. We need to say, okay, what is it that in the old peace operations worked? Why is it that there's a general narrative that is very strong, also in the Security Council, that the models do not work? We need some new, that's why also that we're not deploying new missions, or we're letting the Africans go out and fight their wars. So there's a need to rethink and really think out of the box here to try to redesign, because there is no alternative to the UN Security Council in terms of legitimacy. There's no, and also it's one of the key tasks of the UN is actually providing peace and security and all that, and also deploying some kind of operation. So what role should the UN play in supporting the Africans? What role should the EU play in supporting the Africans in this kind of thing, if we're going to mean that they're going to do it and the UN is not going to do it? Because as it looks right now, the UN deployed numbers are going down. The problem is also, we're also faced with models. I think this picture is up here when was from Darfur, when we was up there. The thing is that in Darfur we have different models. In Darfur we had a hybrid model, UN, AU, African Union partnership. At that time it was told this doesn't work, this model doesn't work, it's not good for anyone, we can't use that in the future. Then you had the Somalia model, where the AU is deploying military forces, a very, very small civilian contingent, and then the US is doing all the logistics, and it's just doing all the political stuff. That model is also deemed not to work. Why? Because the AU is doing offensive military operations. They call it peacekeeping, but it's counterinsurgency, it's counterterrorism. And the UN is providing logistics from a UN PSO doctrine. What does that mean? It means that they cannot provide logistics out to the forward operating bases where the soldiers are operating, because they're not allowed to, because it's too dangerous. So you have a logistics system that cannot support the military operation on the ground. So there's a structural doctrinal issue here as well, which we've not talked about, which is also needs to be addressed if these two things are going to match, are going to work together. Right, good, but we have this thing, again, it's very, also it's in the Africa strategy, it's been used by the Africans themselves, and it's also, it's very commonly talked about in general here, that we want Africa to solve Africa's problems, African solutions to African problems. There's like a theoretical, philosophical thing. Marcus Garvey and the others, Pan-Africanists, talked about this African solution in certain different ways. It was back in the 18th century, coming up and all that we have this kind of idea of all that. Then there's the practical thing. Who developed that kind of idea of African solution to African problems? It was actually the West. I remember when the Danish Defense Command in 2008, they had 4 priorities to when Danish troops should be deployed in Africa. And we didn't want to deploy troops in Africa because it was too dangerous and the Danish soldiers would die, we get sick and all these kind of things. So what the idea was that we train the Africans to do it themselves. African solution to African problems. So it was a concept that was promoted by the donors, that we train the Africans to take responsibility so we can avoid deploying our own soldiers. And if we have to deploy, we can do it in staff functions, in, for instance, peace missions and all that, as support, but not going on the ground because that's too dangerous, we don't want to risk it. I'm being cynical now. The problem, of course, being that why is it that we need African solutions to African problems for solving problems that the UN Security Council consider to be an international threat to international peace and security? Why should the most impoverished continent with the most conflicts in the world be responsible for conflicts on that continent alone when it is considered international problems? And again, in the EU at the moment we talk about these migration issues and all these kind of things. So there's a lot of problems here we need to address, and why maybe also to question that kind of concept, because it is problematic in many ways. So we have this problem that when the African needs to go and deploy, they're not necessarily, they're good soldiers generally on the infantry level, on the small unit level. But in many I'm generalizing now, many African armies do not have officers that are trained to actually do big campaigns, to run brigades, division-sized forces, do large-scale military planning. So we're asking them to go out and do this kind of thing without the capabilities needed to be effective, and without them necessarily the officers, some of course have it, but many Africans do not have all that. So they organize, we ask them to fail acting on these kind of issues. We've seen that in Somalia. We see it right now with the SADC forces in Congo, where we have 2 camps of SADC forces being disarmed, locked down by M23, actually caught as prisoners of war on the mercy of a rebel movement supported by Rwanda. 2,000 troops. They cannot leave the camp. They cannot go out. They're not being. So it's quite critical because of, amongst other things, this thing, and because political incompetency in South Africa and other places. All right. One thing that is also quite interesting about this is, of course, also there was a whole change in how we saw. The African Union saw itself. Again, we have to remember African Union is new, it's young, it's from 2002. It was this whole idea that never Rwanda, never again, all these kind of things. So, we have this idea that we can actually use with the UN Charter, like African Charter, we can go in and stop and override national sovereignty, go in and stop war crimes, genocide, war crimes and all, and this, and that is a part of that. The problem is, of course, in reality, it hasn't happened. They haven't deployed to do that yet because it needs to be decided by the UN General Assembly, AU Assembly, and they haven't been able to that. And the problem is also right now that we've moved away from an idea of human security, AU being a security manager, to now have individual African bilateral ad hoc deployments, what I call the African way of war. And I will come back to that. So, just to give you a bit of an idea of what is that we talk about. There's the Pan-African part. We have Kwame Nkrumah, the former Ghanaian president, divided we're weak, united Africa being the greatest force of good. Again, one of the brainchilds of what the African Union, the African peacekeeping is about. And I think that's important to remember when we see what's going on in the continent at the moment, and we can talk about that also. And then, of course, you have Nelson Mandela, who in 1998, as part of when they founded the African Union and all that, talked about this thing, the right to intervene across sovereign boundaries, to stop atrocities, to stop these kind of and on. And quite looking at what's going on in Africa at the moment, that is interesting because, of course, the AU right now is very, very long away from what's actually going on the ground. But what they decided in 2002 was to have this kind of African, what they call the African Peace and Security Architecture. This was architecture where you have a Peace and Security Council with 15 members from each of the 5 regions. You have a defense policy, you have military staff, which is the chief of staff they meet. You have a standby force, 5 brigades, I will come back to that. You have a panel of the wise, former presidents you can send out to actually to mediate and these kind of things. You have an early warning system to avoid, to actually be able to preempt this kind. And then you have a peace fund where you could money, so you could have money available for financing these kind of things. The problem, of course, being that the peace fund has been totally dependent on foreign donor funding. There's a bit of money in it now, but the African Union doesn't want to use it. And they have there's a problem here because the member states are not paying that use. That's in one thing. The panel of the wise has been quite successful because they have former dignitaries. Again, we have to remember in Africa, being an old man, a woman, with being a former president and all that, you open doors everywhere, and it's important, and it means that you can talk to everybody despite what's going on. The early warning system has improved, but is not quite effective. And one of the problems is, for instance, that if there is a critical report coming out from the early warning system, member states can block it in the Peace and Security Council. So they can, for instance, when you had back in Tunisia blocked, when you had the Arab Spring, Tunisia blocked all these kind of reports coming out from being presented in the Peace and Security Council because they didn't want that kind of information in that. So there's problems there and all that. Military staff has actually been quite successful in meeting and all that, and the policy has been in place. And then we have this African standby force system, which is basically built to 5 brigades, south, southeast, central, West Africa, North Africa, and then we have East Africa over here. The problem is that this is not working. Denmark, and again, I'm part of the responsible ones. I was by the Defense Command sent to Kenya in 2007 to write, together with 2 colleagues, write a report that recommended that Denmark started training and helping the East Africans building up the East African Standby Force. We're still there. It's never been deployed. But it's there, it's functional, it's working. But the East Africans are not using it. So when the East Africans last year, 2 years ago, sent a reaction force into Congo on the Kenya lead, they did not use the East African Standby Force. They used forces from the East African community because there's political problems between Ethiopia and the rest. So it's easier politically to use that kind of force. Again, ad hoc-based kind of operations. Central Africa, Gabon is suspended from the AU because of its coup. ECAS, the organization that organizes this, doesn't work. There's no one in the headquarters. ECOWAS is falling apart. It's an historical crisis. We have the AIS countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, that left. We have 2 coup countries. Chad is not part of ECAS, but they're contemplating joining. We have Guinea down here being a problem as well. So we have ECOWAS, who used to be in one of the strong parties, being quite here. So therefore, we have 2 ad hoc coalitions, the MNJTF, the 5 countries around the Lake Chad. We have the Accra Initiative, the 7 states here, 4 coastal states, and all that, trying to do something. And then we have the new AIS structure here, being a new military force. And then we have Southern African Development Community, which has deployed 2 operations. But in reality, it's South Africa plus a couple others doing it under a static mandate without consulting, but they're informing the African Union. I'll come back to that. So basically, we are built up with a structure right now, which is, in principle, since 2002, we have used a lot of energy to try to deploy, where they were supposed to be able to deploy up to 5,000 troops from each region, where you have troops on standby, which means you can deploy within 2 weeks, for like up to 1,000 to 1,400 battalion plus troops, and then be follow up like a peacekeeping operation to be able to do offensive operation as well. But in reality, this is not working, and they're doing something else. So what in practical, what does that mean? Actually means that we are moved away from African Peace Support Operation, refers to PSO mandated by the Assembly of Peace and Security Council, where the US exercises direct command, control, and management. The only operation right now where this is mandated is the one in Somalia, which is special, which is not a regional organization, it's troops from different countries put together, which gets some kind of UN support, and they're still negotiating that with the new 2719. Most other operations, they are endorsed by or recognized or authorized by the African Union, which basically means that it's the member states of that deployment that has the responsibility, securing funding, running the operations, and they are doing all the planning. They can get assistance from the AU, but the AU has no responsibility. Which basically also means that the whole idea of having the African Union as a security manager that has a responsibility for common security on the continent based on human security principles, liberal principles, which is in the AU Charter, is being undermined by national interest-driven organizations and deployments down here, because basically they do not trust the AU to actually undertake that. Again, back to the 81 people in the PSOD department in Addis being one of the problems. So, one thing we also, let's see, I've got 10 minutes. What we see here is also we see increased, and we talked. Some of you talked about that as well. We see this robustness. We see increased stabilization operations. We have the stabilization operation in Congo. In Mali was a stabilization operations. The mission in Somalia is a stabilization operation, even though there's counterterrorism elements into it, and all that. So we see here there is a lot of issues here, which of course makes the UN and the AU having problems here on how they actually operate. First of all, when we talk about stabilization, there's a very, very big difference between how the mission in Somalia sees itself as being a stabilization operations from a military point of view, to the way stabilization is described by the UN in the DRC, for instance. Where for some, this is a military stabilization, is a military endeavor, where if you ask the UNDP and others, they would say the stabilization is just, can also be soft civilian kind of role, where the military plays a smaller role and all these kind of things. And that again, and respect what you talked about earlier, that we have this thing of militarization of peace operations. And that's what we see with the African Union, that we actually see that they take over these kind of peace operations, they militarize them, the civilian side of these operations are being reduced, merely non-existent. And again, if we know this from the literature, and I've written about it myself many times, we know from a military point of view, military can go in and create space for political solutions to take place. But you got 6 months, maximum. If you haven't solved the situation in 6 months, the opposition will go out and adjust to your tactics and your operations, and you have to change the whole way of your operations undertaken. On the same time, UNDP has a rule. They say from the time the peace is signed or we go in, we got 22 months to be effective on the ground. If we're not effective in 22 months, I started implementing the projects, there's a very big likelihood that these projects collapse. So that we need to keep that. So again, understand what is it that military tool can do, what is that the civilian tools can do, and all that. So. Two examples. As was mentioned, the two SADC, the Southern African Development Community missions, first in Mozambique, Samim, in Cabo Delgado, against Al-Sunna up there. And then you have the SAM in the SADC mission in the DRC. None of them had anything to do with peacekeeping. And I guess I can tell you, both the president and the foreign defense minister in South Africa is very angry at me at the moment because I've said this thing to them. And they claim it's a peacekeeping operation because they're losing soldiers and all that. But put that aside. But this is actually, it's a robust operation. And what is said, did the mandate say? It says to neutralize and disarm. Neutralize Al-Sunna, the Islamic State, in Mozambique, to neutralize M23 in Congo. and to disarm and to assist the Congolese army to do so and all that. So there's nothing to do with traditional peacekeeping. And back to what I initially said about the doctrinal issue here. This is quite important because it's very, very logistically and it's very, very different operations to do offensive military operations than doing peacekeeping operations. So it's two very, very different things. The problem is that in both these issues, the mandates and the capacities and capabilities given to these missions, there's a disconnect. So, again, looking at the mission in the Congo at the moment, we have a situation where they haven't got any air cover. They didn't have any logistics. They did not have any sanitation when they arrived. They did not have any protection of the camps. They had only limited protection and heavy weaponry and all that. They did have limited intelligence capabilities when they arrived. And the forces were put together. They didn't have the numbers they were in the mandate they were given. And the forces were put together with the forces they could find, not the ones they needed, because the soldiers were deployed elsewhere. And then they faced an opponent, M23, on the ground, which was armed, trained, and consisted of conventional Rwandan troops. And they got hammered. And they've lost 23 soldiers since December 2023. So it was something that everyone could see would happen, this thing. The next thing is, of course, and again, it's back to what I said before, about kinetic and non-kinetic tools. The African missions, and again, both in Mozambique, but also in some DRC, there is a focus on the kinetic tools. There's basically, even though it's in the mandate that we need to do some kind of development or capacity building or whatever, there's no capacity to actually do so within that mission at all. And they never managed to do that. Then, okay, say someone else could do it then. And you have UNDP and others come in and try to do it. In Mozambique, it didn't work. Why? Because every time the UNDP tried to do what they have done up in Lake Chad, for instance, building schools, building whatever, a well and all these kind of things, the rebels will come back and destroy the things and be back to square one and all that. So it didn't work well. One thing that we can learn from this kind is, and that's for the future thing, because now we know that we have all these capacity problems here. And we know that the only one with the legitimacy to actually do something is the UN Security Council, and the UN has the experience and all these kind of things. So what kind of role can they play, these kind of institutions, to undertake if the future is that the Africans are going to do an increasing number of the heavy lifting in these kind of operations, because the operations are not going away. The conflicts are not going away. And that is the issue we're faced with. So we need to do something. We cannot let it just happen. So we need to think about that, and we are starting a new project where we actually look at this kind of a situation, trying to look at what kind of tools can they provide and what can all that. There's another problem coming out of this, of course, and that's also been quite critical, of course, and it's the whole role of intelligence and interoperability. Interoperability, of course, being that you cannot talk to each other in mission, been a big issue, and radio systems, language, all these kind of things, meaning that in operations you cannot talk to each other. Intelligence, you're not allowed, again, you're doing offensive military operations, but you're not allowed to do tactical intelligence and actionable intelligence gathering in the mission, because then you're spying against the host nation. And that, of course, means that often you go in these kind of operations, you go in half blindfolded because you're not doing proper intelligence. That has been, they've tried to handle that and all that. The next problem is also, can you trust the host nation? Just to give you an example, in Mozambique, Samim and the Rwandans did not share any operational data to the Mozambican partner before the exact moment they went on operations. So a good example, when the Rwandans had to fly with the Mozambican attack helicopters, the pilot would be told where to fly when they sat in the helicopter. If they didn't do that, all the operational information would be shared to the rebels. And we see the same thing in Congo as well at the moment. You cannot trust the local partner, which again makes it extremely difficult to operate effectively on the ground. And that's back to these kind of things. Funding. Both missions, again, takes a Congo mission here, 25% financed by Congo, I know from the South African Minister of Defense they got the money from the Congo state to actually get 25%. The 75% they expected to get from the UN because of 2719. That didn't happen. So South Africa is paying the bill now, and that's a big, big issue politically at the moment. So that is a problem, and it means that the deployed capabilities you can actually put on the ground, sustain, and these kind of things, means these operations are not sustainable because the funding is not there. And again, if we can't find a funding model, who's going to do this in the future? Right. I think time is more or less off. I had something I wanted to say about MNJTF, but I will skip that and jump to the last one. 2719. I remember when it came out December 2023, I wrote to Sino, who was the head of the POCD in AU, and I wrote to him, oh, this is a game changer. This is a game changer. We agreed and we were up in our say, this is actually the whole problem of financing African peace missions in the future is now being solved. What has happened since? Basically nothing. The problem here being that AU hasn't got the money to actually finance, bankroll these kind of operations. They haven't even got the capacity. The member states do not have the capacity and so all that. If they had the will, it was a national security issue enough, but they might do it and all that. But put that aside. Even the 25%, which is envisioned in that AU is supposed to cover 25% of the mission costs, is a problem to find that. So that is going to be, and they need to find a solution to that. And we see it right now with the mission in Somalia, where we don't know where the money is coming from. I know there's a meeting in May, but let's see what's going on. But at the moment, they have got money for 6 months. African solutions to African problems. A great idea, maybe. But in reality, on the ground, the African Union and the member states, they need all the support they can. We need to think creatively about what kind of aid do they need? Where can we play the best role? Where can we go in, support the best way? Find partnerships, functional partnerships with the African Union and especially the member states. The problem is, of course, that if we go in and let's say we work with the MNJTF in Lake Chad, or we work with the Accra Initiative, are we undermining the whole security architecture if it still exists? That is. And that is the big question at the AU at the moment, and what they're looking at, the whole security architecture and all that. So, we have, and then we need to solve that thing here, that we are actually, the doctrinal crisis, the military crisis, that it doesn't, let's call it what it is. If we're deploying offensive military operations to solve and disarm troops there, then give the mandate to that. Provide the logistics for that. Deploy and configure your force for that. But don't, as we, and again, it's AMISOM Somalia is the best example of how bad this is. The old Somalia mission. At that time, you got a mission, you got a mandate from the UN Security Council, you got a mandate for the African Union, which been negotiated here. They found again, and then the AU gave the mission leadership that kind of mandate and told them, by the way, you also do this, and it's no longer a PSO. So in the CONOPS, which of course is a classified document, and we were there as an AU team, so we got access to that. Suddenly, it was the concept operations document became a policy document where you translated all the 2 mandates you had into something that was operative on the ground that fitted the counterterrorism coin operation you were actually doing on the ground, because you had to call it PSO because you couldn't get the funding if you didn't. So there's these kind of issues we need to solve on the ground and be quite frank about these things. And there's a political issue here. We need to talk about these kind of, what role should the UN play? What should the regions play? What should the AU play? And the Africans need to take ownership for this. They need to find out what is it they actually want. What kind of support do they want? And that's the difficulty, we can't say all that. And then finally, I was a bit, I saw Action 21 from the UN for the Future, and I will end here. And I saw Paul's report and all that, and I was not disappointed. That would be cruel of me to say, but there was nothing new in it. was basically just putting out the same kind of tools you've had already, and then you put on some maritime because that's sexy at the moment. But basically, there was nothing new in that. So what is it? But it's a starting point, because it gives us a better overview of some of the tools, and then we have to have a critical look at these kind of tools and say, should we design this in the future? And that's where our project starts. So, hopefully. I'll stop here. I use 5 minutes too much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Thomas. A lot of issues to be tackled there, to say the least. I think it is time for some coffee, maybe, and some cake. So I would maybe propose to be back maybe 5 minutes past 4. That should be enough. And then we'll have a discussion and a Q&A. So enjoy the coffee and Louise, who's first and foremost our colleague here at DIIS, but she's now at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, leading the UN Security Council project. So we'll have a short discussion. I also asked Louise to briefly talk about the UN, the Danish seat in the UN Security Council, and then we'll have a short discussion, and of course there's time for Q&A. So over to you. Absolutely. At the end, there will be a Q&A, so you can ask your questions. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Corine. You can hear me okay? And thank you to DIIS. It's always great to be back and to be greeted as a colleague. I'm a researcher on leave, and I'm now a civil servant trying to escape work, so that's fine by being here. But I want to thank you, DIIS, also for organizing today's seminar and for the successful conclusion of this program on UN peace and security, which we have been very pleased to fund in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would also like to thank the panelists for your excellent presentations, which I think left us in somewhat of a, well, you left us in a kind of depressed state, but we'll try to pick it up from there and see where the future, if there is a future for peace operations. And I think this topic is one that's very close to my own professional heart. It's one of the topics I worked on when I was while I was here as a researcher, and as a researcher, I've seen it come and go, this discussion on the future of UN peacekeeping. As you also mentioned, several of you, it's not new. There's a strong sense of déjà vu, as Eugene said. But it also means that there is something inherently difficult about these problems. So I think maybe one of the things we should sort of not strive for, but sort of just acknowledge or take as a starting point is that we probably won't be able to find sort of the solution or the perfect model. It will, to some extent, as it has been for the past 75 years, been sort of a modeling through exercise and inventing as you go along and trying to see what you can do with what is available and the political will there. I think that's just a very pragmatic and realistic account of how this thing evolves. That doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for things to be better and to find better solutions and better models and work on all the problems that are there. So, Corine, you also asked me to say a little bit about the Danish membership of the UN Security Council, and you presented me as a leader of the project. I'm not. Well, I'm definitely not. I have several bosses above me. But Denmark is a member of the Security Council. We have been since the 1st of January. We were elected for a 2-year period, as elected members are. And we will actually have the presidency of the Security Council next month in March. It's a rotating presidency, so it's our turn. China has it now, and then we will have it in March. And one of the topics that we will probably put some focus on is precisely peacekeeping or peace operations, and I'll get back to that. But apart from that, we have identified one cross-cutting priority, which is to stand up for international law, which is including international humanitarian law, which is in under some pressure currently. And also to work for better and more efficient and transparent, accountable working methods for the Security Council. And then we have 3 different thematic priorities. And the first is precisely related to the topic of today, adapting peace operations or Security Council crisis responses to new realities, because the world is, as I think it's clear to us all, rapidly changing. Conflict dynamics are changing, and the conditions for intervening or doing something are changing rapidly. Even more so than they were when we initially identified these priorities. And the 2 other thematic priorities are also somewhat related to today's topics, especially the implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which has 25-year anniversary today. And I think it's not today, this year. Sorry, yes, today. No, it's in October, 8th of October, I think, or 24 something. And then the third one, the final one, is climate, peace and security, which is also related to peace operations and what kind of mandates, what kind of role peace operations can have in addressing some of the aspects of climate change that impacts conflict dynamics and conflicts on the ground. But I think for today, specifically the future of UN peace operations, I think what we have, and just the background for why we decided to choose this as one of the thematic priorities, is precisely because we think that peace operations, UN-led and delegated, is a unique and indispensable instrument in the sort of wider toolbox of international crisis management solutions or options that we have. It doesn't mean they're perfect, and as I started to say, they probably never will be, but we can't do without them. So this whole debate or narrative at one point there was about peacekeeping is dead, it was sort of also an attempt to address that head on and saying it's not dead, we still need it. But in what form is of course the difficult answer or the difficult question. I think there's 2 other things before I have a few questions to each of you. Sort of 2 points that I kept thinking while I was listening to your interventions. The first is that interventions are difficult, inherently difficult, both when they happen and when they fail to happen. And I think that's also a thing to keep in mind, that it's not that, okay, so we shouldn't just do anything because that's much easier and better. There is as much criticism of the UN and other actors when they don't do anything. So we need to keep that in mind. And then the other thing is also, you mentioned there was some talk on transitions and how to ensure that all the tasks and all the allegedly good things that peace operations do, how do we ensure that that doesn't disappear when the peacekeepers do? How do we ensure that someone takes over these tasks and fulfill them, or somehow sustain the progress or results or whatever? And I think to some extent that means that even very criticized missions, they have done something. There is something that is worth keeping, worth sustaining, and you need some other actor to carry on. So I think with those sort of 2, even the most criticized missions, they leave something behind, or there is the risk of a security vacuum when they are withdrawn. Is important to keep in mind. And then there's that even if you don't do anything, it doesn't mean that it's a good thing. Interventions are problematic also when they fail to happen. But with all of those sort of opening, kind of lengthy opening remarks, I have a question for you, Eugene, on the tailored. I've tried sort of to focus my questions on dilemmas or tensions. So you have the tailored approach, which seemed to be like suggesting a quite integrated approach, where there's a lot of coherency between what the UN does, and that makes a lot of sense. It's been argued in a lot, but could there be any advantages to fragmentation, to sort of having one part of the UN being able to do something without being immediately associated or seen as part of the whole other set of UN actors there? Because I think we have in the integrated approach this tension always. Do you become sort of guilty by association, so to say, by being linked up with other actors, part of the system that may be more unpopular in certain groups? Can you reach different groups if you are more fragmented, a wider range of groups? And then to Jenny, I thought we talked about it during the break also, the importance of language. How important for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, how important is the specific language? Because as diplomats, we spend a lot of time fighting for language in different documents and holding the line on this particular wording of a specific agenda. How much does that actually matter on the ground for the ability of actors to work on those topics? And you mentioned it, or there was this sort of interesting paradox in, on the one hand, women, peace and security being increased, language being increased in the mandate. On the other hand, a strong pushback, normative pushback against women, peace and security and gender. So how do we reconcile these different tensions? And then finally, Thomas, and the ad hoc solutions. We've also talked about that before in other settings. And I fully agree, this trend towards ad hoc solution has been going on for quite a long time. I think it's important to also, you mentioned, highlighted it, that this is because a lot of national actors want that. And it underlines that when you look at international organizations, the UN or the EU, or there's a limit to what they can do if the national actors want something else. If member states are pulling in opposite directions or going other places, searching for solutions outside of the formalized structures, there's not much to do. So then my question would be, should we then, as a member state of all of these, and as a donor and as an individual country, should we go with the flow, move towards more bilateral cooperations, or should we somehow try to sort of stick with the formalized international institutionalized structures that are bureaucratic and cumbersome, but provide some kind of accountability mechanisms, some kind of control is the wrong word, but some kind of opportunities to actually have a longer term and more coherent approach, as the one Eugene is also suggesting. So I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you. Maybe you can start, Eugene.
Sure. Thank you so much. This question of whether there's benefits of fragmentation, I think it's a really good one. I think we have some challenges that stem from how we've traditionally used terminology. When I'm calling for a more coherent and integrated approach, what I'm not calling for kind of melting all parts of the UN system in the country together into some sort of homogeneous mass. The comparative advantage of the different parts of the UN system comes out of their different expertise, their different level of access with different interest groups, the different types of principles that they have as well, and their different ways of work. So all these have to be factored in to the understanding of how different parts of the system can better implement certain types of activities or engage with different types of stakeholders. And so the idea is to leverage a lot of that in kind of better designing how the UN's overall footprint may look in a particular mission, and how different parts of mandates might be able to be assigned in those contexts. Again, I think traditionally we've thought of integration as being a very heavy top-down structural process dominated by missions. And I think what I'm calling for is really not that. It's really much more of from a ground-up analysis based on who has the right approaches. But I think the other element that's really important here is by using this idea of having missions delegating responsibility of tasks and also providing access to assessed contributions, it also helps address some of the funding gaps that we're definitely seeing in a lot of the funds and programs, but also using assessed contributions as a tool of promoting coherence as well. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. Yes, so the importance of language. So, if you look at the sort of scholarly literature on women, peace and security very broadly, one of the, I think, sorry. Yeah, so I was saying the scholarly literature on women, peace and security in general sort of points out the gap between rhetoric and practice. It's one of the sort of major recurring criticisms. And and I actually think that's really, really key here, because how could you point that out if there was no language? And so this has been one of the sort of big themes, you could say, in the work on women, peace and security, because I think that what language does is to create something that can be held accountable. So I think it's important. And in practice, I mean, it also actually, if you think about the mission staff, I think it makes a difference, because how will you justify prioritizing spending your time on something, let's just say, related to women, peace and security, if there isn't already a priority higher up that is being made? We also know that resources are allocated on the basis of these priorities that are coming kind of from above. And also what we know is that staff who are, for example, gender advisors, where in the mission they are placed really matters. So if they are in the sort of office of the SRSG, for example, they can do a lot more. We also know that often the gender units are understaffed. They might actually have the budget line to hire a senior gender advisor, and then that position ends up being vacant for a really long time. So I think, I think in terms of creating accountability mechanisms, I think language is super important. And I think that with the sort of pushback that we're seeing, I think also defending that language is really important. But that being said, you also asked, like, how can this kind of tension between having seen an expansion in the language and then experiencing a pushback? I mean, I think there are maybe two dynamics at play here. One is the sort of Christmas tree mandate thing that we're talking about, and that's something that also needs to be reconciled, I think. I mean, if you want to implement the mandates, you need to put the resources behind it. Otherwise, you need to think differently. But I think there is also the pushback we're talking about is also a more general pushback, right? That has to do with the sort of rise of more conservative and right-wing and populist forces across the globe, if you wish, who are attacking a lot of gender language, a lot of women's rights, to put it just like that. But that pushback is not only about language. That pushback is also about actual threats of violence against women human rights defenders, for example. And that's very real. So I think, I mean, yeah, I think that we need the language. I think, and I mean, in terms of having language in UN Security Council resolutions and mandates, with a UN Security Council that is struggling so much to agree on anything. Also, we haven't seen any new resolutions on women, peace and security for a while. So that's also something to keep note of, right? Because these for us are consensus based, right? So maybe you won't get the language. Maybe the language will be toned down, and then I think human rights defenders, members, that we're all going to have to work around that and be creative in how to work around that. But I don't think that we should stop campaigning for that language, and that we should sort of give up on supporting and promoting women's rights or gender equality or other human rights as well, you know. So.
Okay. Thank you, Louise. That's an interesting one. Again, I didn't go through my MNJTF Multinational Joint Task Force Lake chats because there's a good example of them. I did an interview with some of the guys in the AU, and one of them said, "Yeah, the thing is, right now, we don't think it's the best solution, but it's what the member state wants. Full stop. So we need to do that." And I think the MNJTF is a good example of how the EU has tried to bridge that thing. Because what has been done is that you have these 5 states, and they put up these different military operations. You have civilian who created a bottom-up built regional security strategy for Lake Chad, where the military is just reduced to being one tool of 9, whatever. The AU has then identified, together with the EU, has identified areas where they can support the MNJTF. And the EU funds via the AU that offers support for the MNJTF on logistics, on strategy formulation, on human rights, for instance, because that's important for the EU. So they send out human rights observers for the mission in the base. So I think the thing is, of course, that should we continue to support the East African Standby Force when they don't deploy? Politically, it's been quite a success. But when I spoke to the director just before Christmas, they had the new strategic review. He didn't know because half the members are not paying. Seychelles just left the organization. So we see things are in flux somehow. Right? So, is that a good idea? What will happen if we stop supporting it? If there's no local ownership? Another example is not from peacekeeping, but the own structure. Right? We have supported this thing. It's more than 11 years now. We have the maritime system in West Africa. The regional zones are not working. The member states are not deploying it. The headquarters are not there. We continue to put money into it. And the member states do not even want to, because we think it's a good idea. And it was an idea that they say, was created by local ones. So again, there's this difficulty. When do we stop? And again, what I try to say is that if we then go in and say, okay, now we support the Accra initiative, which is not working, by the way, either. So let's put that aside. But let's put that. They actually was close to closing it just before Christmas. But let's screw that. But then you're undermining the ECOWAS. And again, I was at the ministerial meeting with the Accra initiative back in 2022, and ECOWAS director was there, and he stood up on the stage and to all the ministers and said, "What about us? What role should we play?" So there is this competition at the moment, and it's extremely difficult to navigate that. And I guess one way of doing it is to try to help the Africans try to find some kind of solution to say, okay, what are we going to do with this? Are you going to change the African peace and security architecture? They had the big Algiers meeting just before Christmas where they talked about these kind of futures, where they looked at the different potential structures and the changes and what the consequences for the Peace and Security Council. And I think we need to be present at these kind of events and try to identify where is it, what is this, how do we navigate that if we're going to play a role? But it is extremely difficult, and there is the risk that we undermine the bigger thing. But the bigger thing is at the moment falling apart. But one good way, back to Jean's earlier statement, 2719, if you empower the AU, then they would have the tool, because then they would be able to finance the peace operations, and then the member state would, if you capacitate the AU to do that, they could play that role again. One could think. But it requires that the UN Security Council is actually managing and getting that in place.
Yeah, that's another bag of worm on getting the Security Council to actually agree and find formulate new mandates for new missions. But I think thank you very much to all 3 of you. I'll open the floor for questions now. If you raise your hands, and then if you have if you'll state who you are and if you have any institutional affiliation. Yes, please. Yes, you, Ture.
My name is Ture Magnussen, and I have to excuse that I will leave the meeting soon because I have to pick up a grandchild in the kindergarten before it's closing. But I have some questions, first of all, to the first speaker who said about the 1988 and referred to the Middle East. Is that the Iraq-Iran conflict at that time and the peacekeeping mission that you include in the Middle East? Okay. Secondly, you said that Guterres is not in favor of peacekeeping missions. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that and what is your source for that. From his speeches, he seemed to have another position. Secondly, Eugene, you spoke about the UNTSO. Could you elaborate a little bit more on their role in the present conflict and war in Israel? Is it also in the mandate of the UNTSO, for example, to make an arrest of Netanyahu or to stop the invasion of Gaza? You also mentioned the gender aspect in East Timor, but probably it's better to put that to Lorentzen. If you could tell a little bit about how the gender aspect was practiced in East Timor. Also in your statement you said about the SEA, sexual exploitation and abuse. Is that inside the peacekeeping mission or is it between the peacekeeping mission and women, especially women of the local population? And for the fourth statement, I would like you to elaborate a little bit about the question of MINURSO, that is to say, the relation between the African Union and previously the Organization of African Unity, and then Morocco on the question of Western Sahara. And because that's a very essential peacekeeping mission.
Thank you. I think
the last question is, Denmark, as you said, would be in the UN Security Council, and there's a conflict, and there's also a debate on peacekeeping missions in Ukraine. Would it be a good idea to have a UN peacekeeping mission there? So that's then I'll stop there.
Thank you, thank you. Normally I would say let's take a few questions and then, but I think we have plenty of questions here and you were kind enough to sort of direct them very specifically to who you would like to hear from. And then if you can be fairly brief so we have time for another round, that would be great. Corine, I think the first one was for you.
In terms of Guterres not being a fan of peacekeeping, is it? Just stand up for the speaker. This is it's not, let's say this is given knowledge, let's say. And Guterres is trying to phase out peacekeeping in the new agenda for peace. And this is also peacekeeping in general as a tool of conflict management. So this is the UN taking a back seat in terms of being a prominent peacekeeper. And this is also what many UN insiders have told me when I was in New York last year. So this is the insight that I can convey to you. I cannot give you a source per se, but this is kind of given or common knowledge in a way. I hope that answers your question.
I'll actually add on to that. So Guterres has on multiple occasions said this, so including when he presented the new Agenda for Peace policy brief and also in the context of his report on the financing of African Union peace support operations, where he pointed to the limitations and struggles of current peacekeeping operations and called for, quote, a new generation of peace enforcement missions with predictable, sustainable financing led by regional operations and where the African Union is an obvious partner in this regard. The issue, of course, is that, if that is the direction we're going, the role of the UN is relegated to that of a logistical support provider and a paymaster, and really not really kind of being able to drive on a lot of the more political aspects of conflict resolution. If I can, since I have the floor, I also do want to touch a little bit about 2719 very, very quickly. I think the goal of adequate financing of African peace support operations is a worthy objective, but I don't think 2719 is the way to this. I think Thomas already pointed out there's some of this element having to do with the limitation to AU-led. But beyond that, if the AU's comparative advantage is rapid response and peace enforcement, 2719 doesn't allow that. For example, using the UN's peacekeeping budget process, it's very, very cumbersome going through the Fifth Committee, the Advisory Committee on Administrative Budgetary Questions, and also subjecting the AU to financial control by the Secretariat will all undermine rapid response. But beyond that, the UN's contingent owned equipment and logistical support framework was designed in the 1990s for static peacekeeping operations. It's not intended to be able to deal with units that have to regularly engage in kinetic operations. Everything from the way that operational ammunition is used and reimbursed, it's not. The fact that you don't have the right provisions to deal with loss and damage due to hostile action, the fact that medical standards, consumables, and scales of issue are also predicated upon kind of static peacekeeping as opposed to war-fighting activities. This framework that's in place in the UN really does not work for these types of things. So it's really important to actually get the financing and all of these types of things right if we want to properly support the operations that we're trying to look for. Now, to get to some of the specific questions that were directed towards me, I'm not sure I actually said anything about UNSO, but I think the ability of UNSO to do very much in Gaza right now is limited because of the broader questions having to do with disagreements between Security Council members in the Gaza, Israel-Palestine situation. Ukraine, though, is a slightly different situation. If, for example, the US and Russia and Ukraine are able to reach some kind of an agreement on what to do in Ukraine, that's actually all the ingredients that you need for some sort of a peacekeeping engagement. The question, though, is that, does the UN have sufficient political confidence amongst all the different parties? I mean, one of the things that's been notable over the last 10 years is that UN peacekeeping is almost never discussed as an option when a crisis erupts. When it's mediation, it goes to individual states. When it's peacekeeping or multilateral deployments, it's the EU or others that are being discussed. The UN is not part of the conversation. Partially, it's this crisis of confidence. I think it's an issue where the UN has not been very successful in a lot of the places it has been deployed. And so addressing some of the problems that I pointed out in my presentation is a way of potentially helping to show that the UN is actually able to help take countries out of some of these protracted crises towards some sort of a sustainable peace. But until that happens, it's kind of hard to imagine that the UN can come. But in a Ukraine context, just to finish, the UN also provides the benefit is that it has a understandable platform by which to engage a lot of other troop-contributing countries. So right now, there's a lot of talk about European countries, but that might not be acceptable to all parties, right? But if you're able to use the UN, you can actually draw upon a lot of other more neutral TCCs to be able to also kind of engage in a very predictable manner, deployed kind of rapidly because those processes already exist. So this is a test to see whether the UN has that political credibility to play a role if a peace agreement is able to be reached. Over. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I think I had two questions specifically directed at me. One was about the gender aspect practiced in East Timor. Actually, I don't think I can say much about that. I have not done any research on East Timor, and so I can't really speak to that peace operation in particular. But on the sexual exploitation and abuse, I mean, that has become a sort of very set terminology, and it is also a sort of the UN has developed its sort of zero tolerance policy on this because it has been a problem, right? And it does address very specifically the I guess not voluntary relationships, but but it addresses sexual exploitation and abuse done by peacekeepers, and it is very much towards the local population. And I mean, I don't work specifically on this myself, so I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think it also covers sexual exploitation and abuse against other peacekeepers. Definitely, and as I said before, also the sort of the problem with this is that when they deploy, legally they would have to be prosecuted by their host countries. So if a peacekeeper commits a crime, they will be sent back home to be prosecuted, which very often does not happen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I had the question around West Sahara. I must say it's not an area of expertise. I don't know anything about West Sahara, basically. So I won't try to answer that. I have comment on the sea case, and I'm going to use this in African.
It was not on Western Sahara, it was on Minurso especially. And
Yeah.
its relation to the African Union
Yeah.
as the last colony.
Yeah, but it's not. Again, it's not an area I've looked at, so I won't comment on that. So yeah, because it's not anything I've been looking at. So so sorry to, like, I haven't got an answer for that. But I will look at the sea case, and I can use the South African example on. I did a bit of work on that, which I think is interesting. There's a problems also in peace operations that, for instance, the African law and UN regulations work against each other. So some of the cases that are considered sexual exploitation and abuse in missions by the UN is not criminalized in South African law.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the issue here. And so you have, and then of course the Africans, they have a mobile team. So every time there's a case, they will move a legal team to the Congo, for instance, and they will look at what's going on and then repatriate people if need be and all that. Most of the cases in this African case are paternity cases, which I guess basically means that you have soldiers engaging with the local population. And one of the interesting thing here is, which some of my colleagues that worked on this in terms of that, is that local women are seen to have quite a bit of agency in this. Because if they get impregnated by South African soldiers, they have a right to come to South Africa. So there's also that element to it, that they use it as a means to get out of Congo and go to South Africa because they now have this kind of thing. So that's another. So it's not just victims and perpetrators, but it's both more difficult than that. I would say.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two, you in the back, and then you, and then behind you. Oh, and we have one here.
Yeah.
So maybe you
Yeah.
can go first, and then we'll see if we can get to you. Okay. There's one gentleman in the back, and then the one in front of you, and then you.
So my name is Mads. I study at the University of Southern Denmark, and I have two questions predominantly at Eugene and at Thomas. So you mentioned counterterrorism, extremism a few times. The PCVE agenda in the UN is kind of all over the whole organization. It springs both from peacekeeping to almost into UNICEF and other organizations. And what is that role in peacekeeping? Because you see the robust missions, the stabilization missions, it's also quite big in the ad hoc and the regional, or the RECs, the regional economic communities, peacekeeping sectors, like SAMIM is against extremists, and also sometimes this like limit between what is, extremism or a separatist group and what is actually terrorist groups. Because, for example, in Mali, the Malian government was actually more content on dealing with the separatist groups rather than necessarily the violent extremist or the terrorist groups. They were kind of this like just a whole umbrella term for all of it. And what is sort of that role in peacekeeping and the further stabilization efforts? Another thing is the European Peace Facility, which was previously the African Peace Facility. What does that matter for these funding problems that you mentioned, Thomas? I know the EPF has funded to a lot of African militaries. They funded to Rwanda in Cabo Delgado. There has also been some issues whether they use those funds offensively. And also now with Ukraine, because a lot of the African nations have talked about wanting offensive military capabilities, which was always denied by the US to a large extent, especially by the EU. And then once the Ukraine war started, the EPF especially gave a lot of that. And then the African countries were kind of like, so why is this shift? So yeah.
Mit navn er Ole Stockholm Jebsen, og jeg har arbejdet med konflikt. Oh, yeah. My name is Ole Stockholm Jebsen, that's still the same. And I have worked with in conflict areas for the last 20 years, but with the soft intervention activities. And I think this is my comment and suggestion, that when we talk about peacekeeping, the object, that the whole purpose is stability, peace and development. And the military action, of course, may well be important, but parallel to that, there is a need for some quick impact, soft interventions. So the local national authorities and the civil societies, they experience some hope and some trust, and that could, my experience is that we can actually intervent quick impact interventions, so they can feel that immediately, because people are living there, even if it is a conflict. And it's important already to start to establish trust and hope. And this is my experience, and I just wanted to have your views on this, because it is important when we, in the future, when we want to really have peacekeeping, that it's linked very carefully with such interventions, which then link into long-term development. Thank you.
Paul, it's English. My name is Paul Mandrup. I think it's a very interesting discussion about UN peacekeeping. I've had a chance to follow various peacekeeping operations as part of UN offices, or also NGO coalitions and so on, for around 40 years. So I have different experiences with the peacekeeping. But I think one thing that the discussion today didn't really open, and that is that peacekeeping is totally dependent on both the parties accepting the premises for the peacekeeping, and the donors actually make the contributions. Now, if we look at Africa the last 10 years, and we look at those missions that have been there, even after the last 5 years, with the AU being officially sort of key in the process, nothing has happened. They are not respected by a number of countries, or their paramilitary forces coming in. The money is not there. I mean, those of us that have been to Addis Ababa can admire the fantastic building of the African Union. It almost compete with the UN in New York, but there are no staff. Walk around and there are no staff. Office after office, empty. And how can the African Union actually fulfill its role if it's not funded? I've had that discussions with people in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other ministries, and I must say I haven't got a very clear answer. So if the international community wants structures in Africa to work, and at the moment I see no better alternative than the African Union if one wants to have that, there needs to be a much more proactive approach to it, including funding. And I was a little bit surprised that that was not part of the interventions or presentations we had. Okay.
We'll have, yes, could you pass it to, we'll take your two questions and then I'll pass the floor to
Hi, I'm Krista. You, Lorentzen, you talked about how the WPS can sort of promote liberal values and international values to the UN peacekeeping. And you, Eugene Chen, you talked about how like a core task for the UN peacekeeping is creating sort of, or supporting democratic rule of law, all these sort of values. But at the same time, you talk about how UN peacekeeping is facing many challenges. And so my question is, do you think that a core challenge to the UN peacekeeping is that essentially it promotes a very Western understanding of what peace is, and maybe holds the premise that peace is essentially a Western phenomenon?
Okay, hello, my name is Peter Albrecht. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. I just want to say that in a few weeks, Corine and I are coming out with a study on the many futures of peacekeeping, past, present, and future futures. And I think you can all look forward to that. But our next little venture is Somalia. And we are revisiting Somalia now that, as you also mentioned, Thomas, that awesome, I don't really know how to say that yet. I'm sure that we will know soon enough, is taking over, and also the many challenges that Awesome is facing. And I just would like to hear sort of from you, Eugene, from the UN. I mean, obviously, Somalia has always been on the map. What role does it play on the map currently, and how much of an emphasis does the UN want to put on its role in Somalia and its support of the AU? And I'm asking you because I know you know about this. And Thomas, obviously you know as well about a lot from the perspective of the African Union. I mean, you said a little bit about, you know, there not being funding for more than 6 months, but what is actually the expectations of Awesome from your colleagues, partners, what have you, in the African continent? It could be both South Africa, it could also be from Addis. And Jenny, we will talk more over dinner.
Thank you, Peter. I think I'll start in the opposite direction now. So if you start, Thomas, and then you and Jenny, and then you can conclude or
have
the final word. Eugene.
There was a lot of questions here, so see if we can remember. I'll start from the end. If you look at I was in AU, I talked to you about AUSOM in just before Christmas. And of course, the sentiment is that the AU could not afford that to leave. Basically because, again, when we talk about Somalia, there's a strategy of 4 phases, all these kind of things. We only managed to get to phase 2. It was supposed to have stopped and be finalized in 2021. So basically the implementation is not. So basically the idea is that if AU left, Somalia would fold. So we were looking into an Afghanistan situation kind of thing. So they couldn't afford to leave. And then we had the whole political issues here, which of course is extremely interesting because you have the tension between Egypt and Ethiopia over the dam project and all that, and the water of the Nile. And suddenly Egypt insists on being part of AUSOM, basically meaning that you have Egyptian soldiers on the Ethiopian southern border. At the same time, they have a crisis where Egypt have said they're willing to go to war if someone takes their water and these kind of things. And of course, Ethiopia is not very fond of that. So there's both the internal dynamic of a failed mission, where basically, again, take the Somali National Army. It's still around a third of the troops that desert. They go to where they go, we don't know. So the implementation, the control, Al-Shabaab is still very much a factor. Now you have Islamic State actually being increasingly present there with a higher number and all that. Now we saw Trump, of course. Yeah, okay. So that's not there. Funding. I think I mentioned it. I tried to mention it with an example of the Peace Support Operations Division of the 81 people. And again, it's a big issue. They haven't got the capacity, and that's also why the member states are pulling back and saying we don't want the African Union to do it because they haven't got the capacity to do it. So why? So for instance, in principle, when SADC had to deploy in Congo, in principle they would go to the AU, ask the AU to help do the plan, And then they go out and do the joint plan, and then would deploy on behalf of the AU as a subsidiarity principle kind of thing. In reality, they don't, because South Africa is doing the planning because they have got the capacity to do so. The AU hasn't, and the AU. Good. Okay, would you answer the counterterrorism one? I'll stop there.
Thank you.
No, that's fine. There's a lot of questions, so.
Yeah, great questions. I'll just stick to the one on the sort of the values and whether a challenge for peacekeeping is that it promotes Western conception of what peace is. Okay. So a challenge. I mean, yes, this is a challenge, absolutely, but maybe not exactly, or maybe I see it a little bit differently. I think it is a big challenge that when peace operations become seen as promoting something that is Western and that is how should I say, like what we saw, for example, in Mali and in the Congo, that this kind of like anti-UN discourse is being used to sort of further other means, etc. But anyway, on the sort of Western values discussion, I think that in many countries, I've worked a lot in Mali. Yes, gender equality is by many considered a Western concept there. But you have to remember that before there was something called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and before there was a peace operation in Mali, there has been a women's movement in Mali that has been fighting for women's rights, and they sort of get support from these international frameworks when there is a peacekeeping operation, when there is funding. So it's not like these are completely, concepts that are, or maybe they didn't call it women, peace and security before, but when they adopted a law on a 30% quota on official appointments in Mali in 2015, the women's movement were very happy, and they were like, we fought for this for a very long time. So it is seen often as the Western values, yes, but that doesn't mean that they don't have any sort of resonance locally. But I think definitely it is a challenge. Yes, I'll stop there.
All right, I will try to get through all the other questions that weren't answered. On prevention of violent extremism, I think there are lots of different organizations within the UN that do this. In peacekeeping, for example, the Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions in the Department of Peace Operations does do some work in this area. In missions, you have a lot in terms of the DDR, disarmament, the demobilization, reintegration. Also in the rule of law areas, they do some of that activity. But I would also note that here you also see a lot of rebranding of projects. There's a lot of activities in the peace building and development space that oftentimes gets, framed as PVE if it gets access to funds provided by donors for PVE activities and vice versa. So there's a lot of blurring of lines here. But the short answer is yes, there is some of that activity happening. On quick impact projects, actually since 2000, with the Brahimi report, there's a recommendation that missions should have funding for quick impact projects in order to win hearts and minds, like early dividends and things like that. The challenge is that over time, quick impact projects have lost that original focus on kind of building confidence. They're now just another source of programmatic activities in mission areas, but they've also created some tension with country teams because there's oftentimes a lot of blurring between what is funded and as a quick impact project versus what some of humanitarian and development activities may be, especially if the quick impact projects are being implemented by military personnel as well. So that this may be an area where we need to go back to basics and see how we can actually use them better for that original purpose. On the financing question on AU, I think this might be an issue where those of us who follow these issues, we use kind of the UN shorthand and jargon. When we're talking about 2719, it's actually about the financing of African Union peace support operations. So everything that we were talking about there is about how do we try to get the sustainable funding for African Union peace support operations. on the question of political processes, I think another way of looking at this is that like the promotion of the liberal peace paradigm with human rights, rule of law, elections, all these types of things. This is really kind of a preoccupation of Western countries, right? So as like with the penholder system where the 3 permanent members of the Security Council from the West, the US, France, UK, like really drive a lot of those mandates, you are going to see a lot of kind of emphasis on these things. But we are seeing some realignment now, right? There are alternative paradigms for what peace looked like. China in particular, Russia and a few others are really championing kind of a more statist kind of prosperity and security is peace type model. And one of the really weird things is that we may see in the next few years a new P3 emerge in the Security Council where it's the Trump administration, Russia and China that might be more in line with this kind of second kind of non-liberal peace version of what peace should be. And so this is something I think we need to keep an eye out for the next few years. And then last sentence just on Somalia and its relevance. I think in New York right now, Somalia is seen as the test case for 2719. So it has a lot of relevance there. But I think one of the weird perversions is that it's the Somalia model, where there's a UN support office there, is now being presented as the best case. Like that's the best model, where it's actually not. The reason for there being a standalone support office there was actually a product of necessity, because back when the support office was established in 2009, there was no other UN like political mission or anything in the country through which to kind of provide a support package or anything. So a standalone entity had to be created to kind of deliver that that support. But that's one of the reasons why there's so much fragmentation as well. So the Somalia context is such a complicated one, and we could spend hours just talking about that. But yeah, so it is definitely driving a lot of the conversations, and not necessarily always in the most helpful ways. Yeah, over. Thank you.
The peace facility.
You have a few words on the peace facility?
If we've got time, yeah. And I think it was an important question. And I think, of course, there's the whole thing about Ukraine and all these kind of things. But there's also be a realization that if the EU is going in and training people, but not willing to train soldiers, but not willing to arm them, and you have other actors that are willing to do that. So if we want to be an attractive partner, we need to go in and do that. So I think that movement has been there for quite a time. And then, of course, the problem with the old Africa Peace Fund and now to the peace facility is also that the funding available for Africa is seen as being smaller and less and all that, which of course is a scare for the African members. The danger in all this is, of course, again, remember when the EU signed an economic trade agreement with Rwanda a week after that Rwanda, there was a big UN proposal coming out, now we're supporting Rwandan soldiers in northern Mozambique, not with a big amount of money, but the EU is paying part of that.
A few words.
Yeah,
a few words. So there's a lot of challenges there. Yeah, there's a few words, sorry. But
Thank you. Thank you very much. And should I just round up quickly? I think this was, for me, and I think hope for all of you also, a very interesting seminar. I think we covered a lot of ground, a lot of fragmentation, and a lot of diversity in actions and actors, approaches. But I think just to end on a slightly positive note, the one thing that sort of ties all this together is actually some kind of relation to the UN and the role of the UN. And I think maybe that's sort of a key takeaway, that in a fragmenting world, the UN remains the only thing that sort of ties it all together, sort of this fragile world, holds it together in some sense. So I think that's perhaps the best, a positive note from today's seminar. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, and the speakers. I think that's a great note to end. I also want to thank you